another one coming up on bullying prevention after lunch. But now we're going to switch gears and we're going to get on stage Monica Bickert, the Vice President for Product Policy Management and Counterterrorism at Facebook, and Jeff Jarvis, the author of Greeks Bearing Gifts. Thank you so much, Jeff, for moderating this fireside, and thank you, Monica, for taking the hot seat.
Thanks, Sabrina.
Good morning. Good morning, Monica.
Good morning.
Why don't you start with a minute of explaining what your job is?
Sure. My job is to lead the team that writes and manages the policies for how people can use Facebook and Instagram. So in plain terms, when you think about our content standards, I have a team of well over 100 people sitting in 11 offices around the world and working with hundreds of stakeholders, including yourselves, to try to craft the rules that will best keep our community safe while still giving people the chance to interact and share what's important to them.
I should start with a disclosure here. I'm at the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism, where I raised a bunch of money from Facebook to work on disinformation projects. I'm independent of Facebook. I receive no compensation from any platform. End of disclosure. Let me start at a very high level. As a journalist, I've come to think recently that we are covering the internet all wrong. We're treating it as a technology story, as a story of machines. And the truth is, especially on Facebook, that it's Soylent Green, it's made of people. And that we should instead be covering the behavior of people, of society, using these tools. And these days in media, there's a lot of moral panic about technology. I think it's a rising moral panic, and that panics me in turn because I love the internet. So at a high level, is Facebook doomed to reflect the worst of society? Does it cause some of that worst of society? Can it help fix some of that worst of society? Go ahead.
I think you're exactly right, by the way. This is about people and human behavior. Before I came to Facebook, I spent more than 10 years as a criminal prosecutor in the United States and also in Asia. And what I've seen is people are people. The vast majority are good. And then you're going to have some people who will engage in extreme abuse. Those people, just like all the good people, are going to use technology and are going to come online. And that means that we will see people trying to use technology to share images of child sexual abuse or to plan criminal activity. I used to even when I was a prosecutor, I was a supervisor for child sexual exploitation and human trafficking cases, but I also did a lot of other types of cases, including things like gangs. We saw gang members using technology. So it's a normal part of the human experience now. Now, I also think technology has a tremendous potential to help bring about good things. And you heard Dr. Ashen, you heard Antigone Davis, you heard Lori talk about some of the positive things that we can see from communication around difficult issues, and a lot of that happens online too. So speaking about grieving and loss, when I lost my husband, social media was a very important part of dealing with that loss. We see young people getting a lot of support in communities from social media. We see people who are suffering from illnesses reach people on social media. And anytime there's some sort of disaster, recently we had the attacks in New Zealand and Sri Lanka. In the wake of those attacks, we see people coming online and using things like Safety Check, Facebook Safety Check, or the ability to offer services or request services, like in Sri Lanka, before the social media services there were blocked. We saw more than 1,000 people in that short window that were offering services, food, shelter assistance, or asking for services on the site. So there's actually a lot of good that comes from these services. There will be abuse, but it's a small percentage of people.
So I recently joined this is a long title, a transatlantic high-level working group on content moderation and freedom of expression, read regulation. So it's about
What's the abbreviation for that? What's the abbreviation?
Oh, I can't remember. That's too long too. And I dreaded it because I'm not a libertarian, but when I talk about the internet, I sound like one. I'm a Kamala Harris Democrat, just full disclosure again. So I dreaded going on this because I thought I can't stand to hear about regulation talk for our dear internet. Some good ideas have come out of it. I've been quite surprised. One is, there was just this week, France announced a new regulatory regime, and the creator of that is on this working group, and kind of got some inspiration from the working group for that regime. And the idea is that legal behavior should be up here and should be dealt with by the platforms. Illegal behavior should be dealt with by courts, by an internet court. And what's happening now is the government is forcing the platforms to decide, in the case of Germany, what is manifestly illegal within 24 hours. And the fear, which I think is well-founded, is that Facebook's going to over-moderate, as it said, over-delete, having an impact on freedom of expression. So that's a quick framing of a different world, where what you see now is in the UK, they're talking about having the platforms be liable to delete content that is legal but harmful. And so if the government is telling you something is legal but it's harmful, so you have to take it down or we're going to fine you, then that is de facto illegal, all of which has an impact on freedom of expression. So we want to handle these bad trends online, but we also want to protect freedom of expression. So let me go through a few things out of that. One is, and this just came from a meeting of this group this weekend, so I'm still trying to calculate this. It was argued strenuously that we should stop talking about content and instead talk about behavior. That a lot of the effort that's going on in the UK report, in Netzstege in Germany, and in a lot of other countries, is about how you have to get rid of content. Well, if you do that, you're saying that some speech is forbidden. And in an American sense of a First Amendment, that's worrisome. So, but however, if you look at behaviors, at behaviors of malfeasance online, people trying to do things that are bad for society, that might be a different way to look at this. So as you look at the world of malfeasance that you're trying to prevent and grapple with and shove off, how do you catalog, how do you view behaviors or actors or content at a large, high level?
We look at both behaviors and content. And the reason is, what we're really trying to do is create a safe community. This is ultimately, it's a business. It's also something we all deeply care about. We want people to come to this place and share their experiences and talk to old friends and make new friends. They're not going to come to the site if they don't think it's a safe place. So it's imperative for us to make sure we are creating that line and creating it globally. And I will be the first to say there's no perfect way to do that. We have a very global group of people using this site. More than 87% are outside the United States and Canada. And look at the people in this room. We come from all over. We have very different ideas about exactly where we should draw the line on some of these topics. So there's not a perfect way to do it. We do look carefully at laws, because often governments share the same incentives that we share in keeping people safe, but especially drawing on the global experience of this room, we all know that different legal regimes are different. And if we went to the lowest common denominator and said we're going to remove any speech globally that is illegal anywhere, we would end up with a very different online experience. That is not the community that we want. What we want to do is focus on safety. We look to laws, and we also have a special mechanism. So just to be very clear, if something violates our policies, which are based around safety, we'll remove it from the site everywhere. If something violates a specific country's laws, that country, the government, can reach out to us and say, hey, this doesn't violate your policies, but it's illegal in our country. And what we can do, if it is an appropriate legal request, our legal team vets it, is make that content unavailable to users in that country only. And then we also publish a report every 6 months saying, here are the governments who asked us to remove stuff, and here's what we removed. So that is a way of trying to satisfy both of these. Now, in terms of looking at content versus behavior, some of our policies are strictly about content. And that's because, and I'll give an example of sharing beheading videos. Sometimes it's not a question of malfeasance. People might share that content not intending any harm. Somebody might share it and say, gosh, look at how awful this group is. I want the world to see how terrible they are. So they actually have a good intent when they share it. But when we've talked to safety experts, we hear these sorts of videos are the sorts of things that you can't unsee. And people can be surprised by them. And we don't think we have the kind of environment where people will come and share themselves if they're going to be surprised by something like a beheading video. And so we've made the decision that even though people might share that content for a good reason, it is not allowed on the site. That's an example of a content restriction. We also look at behavior. We have certain types of behaviors where, somebody wants to harass somebody else, and they get a whole bunch of friends together and they send this person unwanted messages all the time. And if you look at the individual messages, they're benign. But it's a pattern of unwanted behavior and targeted harassment. That sort of thing is hard for us to detect, but when we do, we will remove that as harassment, and we'll remove the profiles as well.
The UK has its recently released online harms report, and what is disturbing to me about it is that a prior Commons committee said we're going to regulate the internet under the harms report. So I waited for the definition of harm to come out in the harms report, and the harms report also punted. Does Facebook define harm?
We look at, if you look through our community standards, you'll see the principles that we draw out, and usually we are talking about real world harm. However, when we do that, we also look at things like things that might make a person feel unsafe to the point where they would not come online, or where they might be tempted to harm themselves. So for instance, promotion of suicide, promotion of eating disorders, bullying, harassment, these are things that we consider harmful that we do remove from the site.
So yesterday I was in the Senate talking about just this regulation working group for a roundtable, and Facebook's name came up often. You won't be surprised. But the theme that came up with great frequency, somewhat surprising me, more than anything else, was transparency. There's a new algorithmic accountability bill being written in Congress. There was a lot of discussion about the need for accountability and transparency. There's a transparency report now that occurs, but a lot of desire to, and I think the idea of releasing algorithms is stupid. Getting the code would be nothing. But the impact of that, some understanding of how it operates in terms of, again, the end result of it. So I heard a lot about this, that I think that being more accountable, more transparent, may not stave off regulation, but would have an impact on regulation, or maybe the result of regulation. And there were two intended audiences for this. One is government, and the other one is researchers. The French regulation that was just proposed does not, in fact, have an underlying regulation of Facebook. I suspect you were involved in this project, so tell me where I'm wrong. But in a role-playing game the regulator held with Facebook, they came out and said, we don't want to change the content of Facebook. What we want is to make Facebook accountable and transparent. And we want to enforce with a stick that transparency. So that the government can know what happens on Facebook and can come back and say, yes, you followed your own guarantees, or no, you didn't. And then secondly, I've heard them say that they want to, at an EU level, get data out to researchers so that researchers can understand the impact, can understand outcome and what's going on. And I know the arguments about transparency. A, getting the algorithm is meaningless. B, there's gaming, and so on. But how far can, I think if Facebook went far in transparency, it would make a difference in the trust that the public has, in the trust that legislators would have, in learning more about the impact the system has. How far can Facebook go in changing transparency?
Transparency is definitely key. It's been a huge investment for us, especially over the past year, and many of you have seen it. From the more detailed version of our community standards, where, I mean, I can remember, I've been in this job now for 6 years, and I can remember several times where there were leaks of the internal guidance that we would give content reviewers. And we then spent about a year saying, gosh, if people really want this level of detail, let's actually just give it to them. And we worked with a number of external groups to make sure that the guidelines that we were publishing, those detailed guidelines, were actually something that people could understand. Because when you're a reviewer, it's popping up on your screen as you're reviewing content in sort of, you have the content and then you're going to different parts of sort of a multi-layered site to check different policies. And we wanted to make sure that we could actually transparently communicate, here's what the lines are. So we spent a long time putting that out. That was April of last year. We've begun these community standards enforcement reports, which for the first time disclose how many pieces of content we've removed for violating different policies. Our last one, we did one in May, we did one in November, we've got another one coming out, and you can see, for instance, this quarter we removed about 3 million pieces of hate speech. We removed about 3 million pieces of terror propaganda, removed more than 8 million images of child sexual exploitation, or stopped it at the gates. So those are the sorts of things that we're now doing that we didn't do before. In terms of algorithmic transparency, I agree with you, it's different. I mean, for one thing, these algorithms are, they are proprietary. Different social media companies, this is sort of what makes the community what it is. But we do think people should understand the basics of how those algorithms work. What are you likely to see when you come to our site and why? And so now, in addition to a series of posts that we put out explaining, here's a change we're making to, for instance, Facebook news feed. You're going to see the percentage of news drop. You're going to see content from friends and families go up. Those sorts of posts that we put out. We also have recently launched a feature where you can click on a post and see why you're seeing it. And it will say, oh, you're seeing this post, Jeff, because you're friends with this person, and because, you know, whatever. We try to explain exactly how you're having the experience that you're having without actually just putting the code out there. How can regulation work with this? For one thing, we do not see regulation as a dirty word. And you've probably seen this if you saw anything that Mark Zuckerberg has written recently. He's been very vocal about the fact that we understand that there will be regulation. What we want is to make sure that it is thoughtful. There are roles for the government to play, roles for civil society, roles for companies, and when we all come together and we talk about, okay, what is the government really trying to do to achieve its goals of safety? What are the challenges that we face? What are the limits of technology? What can we do? That's where you actually end up with some thoughtful regulation. And this French project was an interesting one. For those of you who haven't heard this, over the past year, we've been working with, have I told you this term, the pizza team?
No.
Okay, so so we've been working with this, a group of people from the French government, and when I was initially looking at the memorandum of understanding that was, you know, in draft form that was going around, there was something in there that said there will be a pizza team, and I thought, well, this must be sort of a translation error. But no, actually, this is a thing. So a pizza team is a group of people that's small enough to share a pizza. So we had a couple French government people, and we had a couple people from our company, and these people worked really closely together, and we had the French government people come over and meet with a number of people at Facebook and see sort of how things are done. And that has led to, I think, a really productive discussion about what would be the right way to have transparency and accountability, but also have something that can survive over time and something that's practical and that social media companies, big and small, can meet.
Given that it's French, I would have called it the quiche team. But one more thing about this, and then I want to go to specific instances. Out of the group that I'm involved with, a judge proposes the idea, and I've written about this, of an internet court, as I mentioned before. That now the platforms are being told, if you judge it illegal, then you have to take it down, and if you mess up, we're going to go after you. And that makes no sense, number one. Number two, as the person who proposed this, it's Chatham House rules, so I can't say who it was, but said that means there's no due process, and that means that it happens in private, in corporations, and it means that society is robbed of the process of negotiating its legal norms in public, in a court. So he proposes a court where if there's any doubt or argument about the legality of content or behavior, there's a court to go to, which I kind of like. I think that makes sense. You'd be taxed to pay for the court, but it would also take Facebook out of the job of being police, judge, jury, and jailer. You'd still be the police, you still have to find stuff, but you wouldn't do the rest. Is that appealing?
It is appealing. The idea of having some external group that can help us make these decisions is definitely appealing. And that's why we are now in the process of, we're exploring and in the process of figuring out how we launch an external review counselor board that will help us make decisions on particularly difficult or contested content cases. But I also want to be real here. We get millions of reports of potential violations every week. We have 15,000 people around the world that are reviewing content every day as their primary jobs. We're not going to have a situation where there is some sort of external court that can make these decisions. What we can do is, and then this is what we're trying to do with our external review board, is find ways for specific pieces of content. You know, right now, if your post is removed from Facebook, you can appeal that, and then we have somebody else at Facebook take a second look at it. But the external review board, the idea is, if you still don't like the answer, you've got the right to go to this external body. And by the way, it's been interesting. We've been doing these sort of workshops around the world trying to figure out the right way to do this. And one thing we're hearing from people is Facebook can't pay those judges or people directly. There's got to be some sort of independence. Now, ultimately, you know, we are running this. So this is a challenge, but trying to figure out what's the exact selection process and then trying to set up some sort of trust or something so that they can be independently paid and trying to establish some sort of boundary is going to be very important for setting this up.
I think it's going to be very hard, if not impossible, for you to create something that's truly independent. And that's why I'm intrigued by this idea of government doing its job. Government has abrogated its job to you. Government can't handle this. They can't handle the scale. They don't know what to do.
And which government? I mean, there's all...
Every government, exactly.
Are we talking about, you know, India? Are we talking about the US? Are we talking about Vietnam, Australia?
Right. So let's go to a few specific cases and see what's to be learned from there. The first and most obvious is that, 2 weeks ago, Alex Jones finally went bye-bye, Farrakhan and others. And the question that I hear from everybody in discussion, so I'll ask you the same question I hear, is what took so long?
So we have very clear lines. Those are public lines. And when people violate those lines, their account may be removed and they can't come back. But we don't take that sort of judgment lightly. I mean, it's a really big deal to say you're just not welcome on Facebook at all. So what we do is, first we will look to see, the lesser sort of punishment is, has somebody posted content that violates our standards? If so, that content will be removed. Let's say you post something that violates our standards. The post is removed. At a certain point, the entire page may be removed. But the very highest level is that the person is not allowed on the site at all. And for that, we look at a combination of your online violations. Okay, you've had 2 pages that have been removed for X, Y, and Z. And then we also look at offline behavior. Some of our signals include things like praising known hate leaders, calling for violence in some sort of official or public comment, using as part of your organization's logo something that is affiliated with historic hate or violent movements, like using a swastika in your logo. So these are the sorts of offline behaviors that we look to. So when you look at somebody like Alex Jones, I was actually asked this. I was down myself with Congress, this is maybe like a year ago or maybe last summer, and I was asked, why does Alex Jones have a presence on Facebook? And the answer was, he hadn't crossed that threshold. So we had removed content, we'd removed individual posts. Ultimately, some of his pages came down, but his offline behavior did not rise to that very extreme point at which we will say, you are no longer welcome on the site. Well, over time, we do assessments, we do periodic assessments where we will look to see what are the offline behaviors, and we will do, usually there's sort of a group, and we do these announcements from time to time. We'll come out and we'll say, there are a group of people that we are now banning from Facebook, and so he was in this last group based on recent behavior, as were a couple of other people. What was interesting to me, it was sort of a comms lesson for me, because a number of people said, but you already banned him. So Facebook banned him, and then he snuck back on, and then now you're banning him again. And no, he wasn't banned before. He had had pages removed before, and that is just about his online content. But what's happened now is he's not allowed to have a presence on the site.
It's hard to see what he's done worse in the last 2 months than he did a year or two ago. He has been heinous and horrible for a while now. So what was the line that he crossed?
We look at things like what are comments that are praise or support for known hate leaders. And that can include, for instance, for somebody like him, having people on his show where he celebrates them or that sort of thing. So that's the sort of behavior that we look to. But again, this is a really extreme measure. To say, and we do this with terror groups, we do this with organized hate groups, but to say, you're not allowed to use our services, even if you are using them just to talk to your kids or just to talk about the weather, you're simply not allowed in our community. That's a really harsh line. It's a harsh punishment, and we impose it when people meet this very high threshold.
So Alex Jones fits under an ugly umbrella of hate speech. There's other things in that umbrella. Talk about how you define hate speech, define the harm of it, and tackle it. And at the same time, if I may, guard against impinging on freedom of expression.
This is, I think, our most difficult policy. Well, in terms of content removal, this is probably one of our two most difficult policies, the other one being what we do with misinformation. But in terms of hate speech, one thing that makes this so hard is culturally it's so different around the world. You have the United States where hate speech is often protected speech. And then you have other countries where hate speech is a very expansive definition and it's criminal. And it would include something like criticizing burning your country's flag. And so where we fall is actually where we don't allow attacks against people or groups of people based on historically protected characteristics like race, religion, gender identity, sexual orientation, and so forth. So it does mean you can criticize a religion. You can say this religion is awful. You can criticize a country. Where we will draw the line is if you are attacking the people. A couple years ago, this was a pretty blunt approach. It was simply, if you say something nasty and it's against a person or group of people, we will remove it. Over time, what we've realized is it's important, especially as we dive into proactive detection, and we're actually looking for this, it's important to have sort of severity tiers. So if you look on the site, we now publish all these details. Tier 1 attacks, that's calls for violence against a group of people or comparing them, dehumanizing comparisons, saying these people are scum, these people are parasites. A lower tier is saying something, claims of inferiority. These people are stupid. These people are ugly. And then the bottom level is calls for exclusion, because sometimes there are times where people might have a non-hate-based reason for saying, for instance, we don't want men in this all-girls school or something like that. So we, just like the law does, we look at these different types of attacks. One thing that's interesting, and you've mentioned the NetzDG law in Germany, we've seen that governments also struggle with defining hate speech. In Germany, we've looked at the hate speech law, which we are in some ways charged with enforcing, because the NetzDG law requires that we remove something that is illegal, but we have to make that determination, as you pointed out. We've seen German courts disagree on where that line is. We have removed content that calls immigrants vermin or scum, and had German courts say, no, that doesn't violate hate speech, you've got to put it back up. So we're in some really interesting waters when we look at hate speech.
But you could still keep that down based on your terms of service, not on legality.
We could,
Yeah,
yes.
okay, all right. Misinformation, you mentioned that.
Yes.
And said that's challenging. Ain't that so? As Facebook often says, no one wants Facebook to be the arbiter of truth, but some of these laws, some of these regulations put you in that position. How do you grapple with that?
It is interesting, because on one hand we hear people saying, Facebook feels too powerful, social media companies are too powerful, and then at the same time we also hear this refrain of we need social media companies to remove misinformation, which can make social medias, really making some decisions that perhaps they shouldn't be making. So what we're trying to do, well, first of all, there's a big component of this that is research and iteration. We're trying to see how misinformation spreads and see if we can counter the unique virality that social media introduces into communication. And so right now, we use a network of almost 50 fact-checking organizations around the world. If something is marked as false, likely false, we can send it to these third-party fact-checking organizations. They can also choose to fact-check it themselves. And if at least one of them comes back and says, this is false, and none of them come back and say, this is true, then we will demote that content by up to 80%. What that means is it just doesn't get the same distribution. It can't go viral. It is seen far fewer times. And then we also put next to it content from the fact checkers or mainstream media sources that shows why this content has been adjudicated false by the fact-checking organizations. One of the things that's been important about that is we're looking to organizations that have met a certain independent standard for fact-checking. But here's one of the shortcomings. That is really hard to do in certain countries. Some countries just don't have certified fact-checking organizations. It's also really hard to do in a hurry and at scale. So when we see conflict in a country, sometimes what we'll see in the wake of that is there's a whole lot of stuff out there that people want these fact-checking partners to fact-check, and they're just not that big, and they can't do it that fast. That's a real challenge. So what we're doing in addition to that is a couple things. One is we're looking at ways that we can more quickly identify and remove fake accounts. Fake accounts are disproportionately responsible for bad content on Facebook, but also sharing misinformation. And remember I said earlier that we removed in last quarter of 2018 around 3 million posts for hate speech. Okay, by contrast, fake accounts, I think we removed like 750 million. Now those numbers are really big. And now we're stopping about 1 million accounts a day at the time of creation for anomalies that suggest those accounts might be fake. So all of this is a part of trying to reduce that misinformation. We are also working on campaigns to help develop sophistication, especially in young people, in understanding what media they should trust. That is a longer term game, but ultimately I think at the heart of this.
It ain't just young people. A recent study from Princeton and NYU took a corpus of awful, bad, stupid fake news and said, who's sharing it? It's people who look like me, old white men. And which is to say the kids are all right, grandpa's screwing up the world. And what do we do about grandpa? I think we want to go to questions. Let me make one more note here. I think that part of what we also have to do is get research on the impact of interventions.
Yes.
As has often been said, putting up a fact check saying this is false could make people believe it more. And so for Facebook to share data with researchers so that we can research these interventions, I think is going to be critical.
Yeah, and sorry, one last point on that we actually did learn that. So when we started this project, what we would do if a fact checker rated it false is we would say disputed. And what we realized was that was not having the effect you might expect. And so what we instead did was we just said, hey, here's what the fact checker actually says, and here's some other information so that you can make an informed choice.
Questions? Desires, wishes, anyone? Back there. It's always that awkward first moment before someone steps up to the microphone. Oh, two of them. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. This was super informative. What I was missing, perhaps, and this is obvious because I work with children, and we are trying to prevent and address the issue of child sexual abuse and exploitation, not just online, is perhaps the conversation about that probably 1/3 of all the internet users and users of your services are children. And so behavior versus protection of privacy, how do you deal with that? That you actually are not sure if it's a child or not on the other side, and when we sign or the child sign consent, they don't know what they sign or agree to, and some of them maybe they don't even read, but they post pictures on Instagram.
Thank you. There are a lot of things that we're doing here. One is, as probably all of you know, to use Facebook or Instagram, you have to be at least 13, and in some countries that age is higher. We do have technical mechanisms that we use to try to detect if somebody is lying about his or her age to use the site. But once somebody reaches that age, it's not magical. It doesn't mean they suddenly understand how to keep themselves safe online. So, as you know, there are resources we offer on the site, including our safety center and our parents portal, and we're trying to reach not only young people, but also the people who are the influencers and can help them figure out how to be safe online. I will say, as the mother of 2 teenage girls, I have an 18 and a 16-year-old, we have a line on Facebook, and I think it's still in our safety center, that says safety is a conversation. My experience has been this is very true. With both of my girls, we had a number of conversations, and I saw a number of mistakes where they would go online and have a certain experience. We would talk about it. They would learn. I would learn. And this is something that I think young people can best navigate this when people around them are willing to engage in this conversation. That's one of the reasons that we do so much work with the groups that deal with children, with parents, with educators, and with safety groups around the world.
Back there. If you could ID yourself.
Yeah, sorry. Hello, yeah. So I think this is one of the comments that I wanted to make in terms of transparency and Facebook. I think as a community, what we hear is there is a lot of reaction based on which Facebook then releases reports or then makes the data available, etc. So nothing seems to be done proactively, in the first place. And I think that has been very concerning, because there is a leak or there is a piece of information that gets released on people's data being leaked or people's data not being handled well, then Facebook puts a system in place, and then those reports are released. So I mean, one of the things would be, it would be nice for Facebook to proactively sort of look at some of these issues that are emerging or could emerge in the future, and proactively put out to the community as to what Facebook intends to do to develop that trust and sort of build that trust with the larger community.
It's a great point. I will say that a lot of what we do is actually proactive. Now, some element is always going to be reactive, because sometimes we're slow to act on something, and we will learn about something, and society continues to evolve, and we'll see new things crop up, and so some of what we do will be reactive. But at the same time, we have a team under me that works with hundreds of groups around the world to identify areas where we should be refining our approach. Sometimes that's refining our policies, sometimes that's building a different tool. We have research that we're doing to understand how are people using our reporting flows. Is there something we could do to get more reports in? An example is this human exploitation policy that we are launching. That is in large part because we've gone out and we've solicited feedback, and people have said it would be easier for people to report content if they understood in one place on the site all of the things that you prohibit. And we've said, okay, we'll do that. So there's a lot that we do proactively, but some element will always be responding to what we're hearing in the community.
Monica, I think we just got the flashing red light. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Let's thank Monica if we could.
Thank you all. Thanks for being here.